Species spotting. Life's an everyday adventure. That's my philosophy. I awoke one summer morning to an extraordinary sight. I thought it was a solar eclipse because a big black spot was blocking out the sun. After I rubbed my eyes and took a closer look, I realized a giant spider was hanging above my head. I screamed, "Ah!" jumped up, hopped into my moccasins, and made tracks out of my room, anxiously searched for my parents to tell them about our scary new house guest. I found my parents reading the newspaper and eating breakfast in the kitchen. "Mom, Dad, quick! There's an enormous spider in my room!" I exclaimed. They both looked up but were slow to respond, so I continued. "I repeat, a spider, a tarantula, huge, scary!" My mother lowered her paper and gently asked, "Are you sure you weren't still dreaming, Sweet Pea?" I frantically shook my head no. My father chimed in next. "To put you at ease, Miss Molly, that can't be a tarantula, because tarantulas don't live around here." I still had some doubts. But what if someone's pet tarantula escaped and found its way into my room? I questioned. "I don't know, Miss Molly. That's a long walk, even for a creature with 8 legs," my father reasoned. "But why don't we all go and see if that tarantula is still hanging around?" As we all walked to my room, I turned to my mother and asked, my voice trembling a little, "Are you ready for this?" "Of course. I love exotic creatures," my mother responded. When we went to my room to look for the giant spider, it was nowhere to be found. "Where did it go?" I nervously asked. My father said it probably ran off to find a quieter place to hang. I thought, maybe there's a place near here where we can discover other rare, exotic, and perhaps even unknown species. My toes were tingling madly. An adventure was beginning. I decided that the tarantula was going to be nothing compared to what we were about to find. So I called up my trusty friend Marco and told him it was a perfect day to go exploring. He agreed and said he would meet my mother and me down by the brook. The very first animal I spotted was a big purple hippo bathing in the distance. Marco and I jumped for joy. My mother, who was standing near us, said with a kind voice, "That's not a hippopotamus, Sweet Peas. The hippopotamus is a species that dwells only in Africa." We carefully ventured a little closer, only to discover that my mother was indeed right. What we thought was a hippo was actually a boulder being splashed by the stream. Next thing we knew, a strange loud noise was right above us. "Watch out!" I shouted as I dove for safety. A large creature had flown directly overhead. "Much too large to be an ordinary bird," I said back on my feet. Marco agreed. "That must have been a pterodactyl," he exclaimed. Marco and I gazed up at the beautiful winged animal. My mother, who was now peacefully sitting under a tree watching us, piped up and said, "Actually, you two, that couldn't be a pterodactyl. Dinosaurs have been extinct for millions of years. I think your flying dinosaur is actually a hawk." Marco and I were a little disappointed, but once again, she was right. We searched around for more interesting creatures, and after a while, we saw something odd. "An anteater!" I exclaimed. Marco replied in a knowing voice, That's not an anteater, Molly. It's a panda bear." We ran over to take a closer look. My mother overheard our chat and kindly shared, "Anteaters live in Africa and Central America, and panda bears live in China. I think what you saw was just a very large squirrel." We were starting to feel deprived. "Why don't any exotic animals live in our neighborhood?" I asked. "Actually, to someone living in China," she answered, "a squirrel might seem very exotic." Then she gave us a big smile, trying to cheer us up. Marco suddenly seemed deep in thought. "What's up?" I asked. He covered his lips with his finger and then pointed to his ear. I guessed he meant we were supposed to be listening, not talking. Then I heard it. We crept over to the water's edge, and to our delight, there, right in front of us, was a big, fat bullfrog sitting in the mud. I looked over at my mother and pointed at the bullfrog. "A bullfrog," Marco and I both stated with confidence. "Absolutely," she replied. "Bullfrogs are indigenous to our part of the world." "Indigenous?" I slowly repeated. Yes, it means something that lives or grows in a certain place, she explained. And now, she said as she stood up stretching, it's time to take my favorite two adventurers home. On the walk back, we ran into a certain milk-bone medium mutt. Oh, well, now here's an indigenous animal, she said, smiling. Indigenous to our house, I said as we all laughed. So, with tired and tingly toes in my moccasins, I learned that every place in the whole world has its own unique indigenous species. Molly Moccasins, everyday adventurer.